Hello world, my name is Mohit Deshpande, and in this video I want to talk to you about strings. So what is a string and how do I declare it? Well, a string is really just what it sounds like, right? It's a string of characters. So I can declare it by saying my string is equal to, this is my string. And you notice that as opposed to a character, strings are put in double quotes, right? And this is very important that we put strings in double quotes. And then I kind of want to take a little sidebar and talk about the naming conventions that Java has. Did you notice how I named this my string with the my, where my is in lowercase, and then the first letter of string is capitalized. And that's sort of the convention that we're going to use throughout this course, in the sense that any sort of variables are going to be in what we call camel case, means that the first letter is it's not capitalized, and then every subsequent word is capitalized. So I can I can have something like another string that is really long. And this is sort of the case where I have another being in lowercase, and then string that is really long is, although those are words that are all capitalized. And then we use this as opposed to, we could have like the underscores, is I guess is what C and C++ programmers use, but for Java we're going to use this. Except for when we talk about classes, and you can see, hello world, I have it in what we call Pascal case, which is exactly like camel case, except for the first word in the series is capitalized. But we'll talk more about that when we get to classes. Now, there are some things that you can't name in Java. So, for example, you can't start a variable name with a number. So I can't do something like int 35 or 30, yeah, 35 pi. I can't do any of this. I can't start it with, first of all, if you'll notice, the error here is it's an integer, and yet I have a floating point here, so it's going to do something kind of interesting. We're going to talk about when we talk about operators, but you notice I'm not allowed to declare it as a valid variable because it starts with a number, right? So, and I just want to illustrate that this is the naming convention that we're going to use. But I just want to let you can use other naming conventions, but this is what we're going to be using, because this is kind of the de facto standard of Android and Java. Now, if you do look at the inner source code, some people prefer to prefix things, like if it's, when we talk about static, they might say like S and then the name of the variables, but we're not really going to do that because we have, modern IDEs that can do a lot of autocomplete. That was the sort of naming styles were useful when we didn't have IDEs and we just had text files that you had to sift through, so you could immediately know if a variable was static or not, whether it had, S before it. But from now on, we're not really going to do something like that, because we have modern and awesome IDEs that do autocomplete for us already. And there's one more naming convention that I want to get to, and that's to declare constants. And I'm going to talk about this later, but you declare them using final. I'll do, int number of planets in solar system. So, this is what we would use if we had a constant, and that is all caps separated with underscores. And this is sort of, like I said, these are all sort of conventional based things that we've been doing for, years and years and years, particularly with this underbar system. And we really don't see the underbar anywhere else other than when we're declaring, constants like this. But anyway, these are sort of the naming conventions. And then one thing I should also mention is that you shouldn't name, it's not possible to name a variable type after a reserved keyword. And Eclipse is going to be really helpful because reserved keywords will be, in a different color and possibly some sort of different text style. So, I can't have an integer named int. It's just not, it's not going to go so well. I can have, int A or int B, but I can't have int, and that's just sort of, a given in the sense that how will we be able to tell the difference? So this is just one of the things. And then I should also note that when you're naming variables, you should name them something useful. So something like, int C equals 43 is not going to be terribly helpful. Or say 45 is not going to be terribly helpful. If I say something like int speed limit equals 45, you can see that's more descriptive. So you want to name your variables descriptive, but you also don't want them to be like another string that is really long so that they're overly, what I mean? You just have to find a balance between the two. Anyway, this is enough aside about variable naming, but I just wanted to get you used to these conventions. So let's get back to strings. And I know the question that you're going to be having. If a string is denoted by double quotes, how do I have a quote inside a string? So let me show you how we do that. And that's what we do is it's called escaping characters. So I can do string quote, and I can have something like Bob said, and then I would have my quotes here, except it's going to throw an error here. So what I have to do is I have to escape them and put a backslash. So now it's a perfectly valid thing, a perfectly valid string. So you see it's Bob said, and then backslash quote, and the string will actually register that to be an actual quotation mark. And I can do the same thing with backslash single quotes. And of course, how do I type in a backslash? Well, it's backslash backslash, exactly what you'd expect. And like I kind of mentioned very briefly before when we were talking about the difference between print and print line, there's a couple other characters, but we're not going to go too much into them, and that is backslash n, which is new line, and then the other similar ones like backslash r, which is character return, and then there's backslash t, which is tab. So really, these are just some of the ones that you'll probably helpful to know backslash quote and backslash single quote. But so, I mean, this is just sort of something that is going to be useful to you later on if you're ever wondering how to put quotes inside a string. And of course, you can put any sort of Unicode characters that you want with backslash u and then the value, and that'll put like sort of like any sort of special characters, or like a C with a circumflex, or an N with a tilde. But I'm not really going to talk much about that. But anyway, these are strings, and strings aren't exactly primitive types, and you can see that even the syntax coloring is sort of helping you out, and the fact that it is capitalized sort of denotes you that string is actually a class instead of a primitive type. But it's so ubiquitous that it's very, I mean, people with string is so ubiquitous in the sense that it helps you to output human readable text. So anyway, in this video, what we covered was, what a string is and how we declare a string, and we went into some of the naming conventions that we'll be using, as well as some of the best practices for naming your variables. You want to name them something useful. And then I talked about how do we do certain escape characters, like how do I type in a quote if I use quotes to denote strings, and then we talked about use a backslash quote to denote that. So these are what we call, these are just strings, and this is sort of what I've been talking about over the course of this video. And strings are really awesome, and they're going to be really helpful much later on when we get to Android, because we want to display human readable text to our user. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about what if I have multiple ints? Do I need to create an integer variable like A, B, C, D, E, F, so on, so on, so on? I'm eventually going to run out of things to name it. So we have these things called arrays, and arrays are just lists of, a particular type. But I'm going to talk more about arrays in the next video, which I hope to see you all in.